Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you have found a seat so we can get started. Okay, so good afternoon. Wonderful. Let's do it again, and now with a little bit of gusto. Good afternoon. Wonderful. My name is Mari Kira. I'm a core faculty member and a research director at the Center for Positive Organizations. And like many of you, I have followed a Positive Link speaker series for years and years and years, but this is actually my first time hosting. So I'm very happy to welcome you to today's session, and I'm extending my welcome on behalf of us all at the Center for Positive Organizations. The mission of Center for Positive Organizations is to inspire and encourage and enable leaders and employees to build high-performing organizations that actually bring out the best in people. And besides of research, we actually also want to translate the scientific knowledge into practical applications that can be very useful to organizations around the globe. And one of the ways we do that practical application is to organize Positive Link speaker series. And another way we do that is that we try to connect people who are interested in positive organizations to one another. And that's why I would encourage you to take 1 minute and get to know somebody who you don't know yet and make a high-quality connection to that person. So let's stand up, find somebody you don't know, close to you, and let's take 1 minute. I think it was minutes. Okay, wonderful. Before I introduce our speakers of today, I would like to take a moment and thank our sponsors whose generosity has made it possible for us to be here today and throughout the academic year. So we at the Center would like to thank Diane and Paul Jones for their long-term dedication to our speaker series. So why don't we all give a round of applause to Diane and Paul. Thank you. I would also like to express our gratitude to Lisa and David Trues, who joined our sponsor group this semester. And I would also like to thank our organizational sponsors, and here I have to take a look at my papers, and they are University of Michigan Organizational Learning, Sanjay Leadership Center, Tolber Institute for Global Operations, and Samuel Zell and Robert H. Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies. So thank you very much, all of our sponsors. But now I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers. During this semester, we have had really wonderful, amazing speakers, but today we are going to raise the bar even higher. We are going to have 2 amazing speakers. Kathryn Heinze and Sara Soderstrom. Kathryn Heinze is an associate professor of sports management here at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on ways in which individuals and organizations lead social and cultural change in various contexts, especially in contexts relating to wellness, health, and sports. Kate's work has been published in several high-ranking journals, and in 2014, she received Administrative Science Quarterly Award for Scholarly Contribution. Sara Soderstrom is an assistant professor of organizational studies and program in environment, also here at the University of Michigan. And Sara's research focuses on how corporations engage in social sustainability challenges and how individuals in organizations form coalitions when they implement sustainability initiatives. And Sara is an amazing teacher. 2016, she received the LSA Individual Award for Outstanding Contributions to Undergraduate Education. Now, Kate and Sara they have a lot in common, so I could come up with 3 things that they have in common. Well, first, they are both undergraduates from University of Michigan, so go blue. Wonderful. And actually, they also were in the same graduate student cohort at the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern University. And then the third thing is that they are both faculty associate at the Center for Positive Organizations. And well, they returned fortunately to University of Michigan, and they started to collaborate. And today we have the opportunity to hear from their collaboration and its results. So Kate and Sara, please take it away.
Wonderful. Oh, and my mic is now on, so that's good. Thank you, Marie. We're really excited to be here today, so thank you for joining us. It's an interesting path to reflect on how we both started at Michigan, went to Kellogg for our PhDs, but didn't actually work together until we found ourselves back at Michigan. And coming from a management program, now being in 2 different parts of U of M, but still connected to management, we found ourselves seeing all kinds of interconnections across our research. And one of the things we really enjoyed about the opportunity to speak with you today is to think about how a lot of our different work, both together and individually, has connected along different lines as we have continued working on it. And it looks like we're waiting for the slide, maybe? There we go, okay. And so part of what has motivated our work is really thinking about how companies and nonprofits and other organizations are working together in engaging in communities. And that stems from work both of us did with our dissertations and has continued today. And so we'll talk through quite a bit of that as we go through our presentation. As I think about this question of the role of business and business in society, I would say my parents probably align more on the hippie side of things than the business side of things. And so it's been really helpful for me to continuously be thinking about the role of business as an actor for good against a foil that I sometimes see and hear of as business as being more contentious. And what has been fascinating as a scholar is starting to see more and more of this conversation occurring all around us, right? So in the past just 5 years, we've had groups like McKinsey and Company highlighting and redefining the lens of capitalism and against the more traditional role of a Friedman shareholder value. We are in business to make a profit and maximize profit, recognizing the importance of profit, but the role of business in actually working to create incentives for addressing human problems. Business is uniquely situated to be able to address these problems in a way that helps scale and helps scope. So when you can make that profit, that enables you to reach more people and help more people through the products and the services that you offer. And so that was kind of the lens that McKinsey and Company was taking in this one thought piece. And then more recently this year, how many of you have had a chance to read Larry Fink's memo for 2018 to CEOs? So for those of you who have not, I recommend you go and Google and read his memo that he sent out earlier this year. And so Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, right? Huge investment company and key role in analyzing businesses across the world. And he sent a memo out to all of the CEOs highlighting this critical role of business in addressing societal challenges, highlighting the role of all of us as consumers in pushing businesses to think about that impact, but also noting that it was something that BlackRock was going to be asking all of their analysts and others to look at for companies going forward. Right? So pushing forward this lens of not just what are your quarterly profits, but also what is your impact in society? How are you thinking about that, and how are you engaging with it? A lot of this idea of business as operating for good is what motivates Kate and I as we think about our work and our teaching, and what excites us about some of the things we're going to be highlighting today. It also brings up the question, what is impact? What does this even mean? And this remains uncertain. There are multiple day conferences talking about what is impact, how do we measure it, how do we think about it. Across practice and academics, there remains debates around what do we highlight, how do we conceptualize impact, and what does that mean? And so we thought it would be helpful as we start today to go back to one definition of impact and reflect on what that might mean. And so this comes out, and I think I'm going to take a minute here to read, actually. Impact, significant or lasting changes in people's lives brought about by a given action or series of actions. Talk about an inspiring approach to think about what you're doing. How do we, and I'll add positive impact here, right, make a positive, significant, and lasting change on people's lives? How does our work make that better? Right? How do we understand the action or the series of actions that cause that change? Right? What is the causality that we might see between the actions we take individually within our organizations, that organizations themselves take, that work to improve people's lives? Now, on the one hand, that's inspiring and motivating. On the other hand, it's a little overwhelming. Right? So how do we see different organizations managing that? And Kate and I have really focused across a number of projects on looking at that from the lens of the partnerships that are built. And I want to highlight some of the traps that we see often, and then we'll show the lining of some of the pathways that help us get past that. So as we highlight this aspiration, right, making people's lives better, making business sustainable, addressing poverty, climate change, these are really noble and inspiring and exciting ideals, but at times, by focusing solely on the aspiration, people are frozen by that overwhelming scope and width, and we see challenges in moving forward. We see people wanting to evaluate so that they can say that they've made this impact, that connection between action and improving lives that we want to highlight with a causality around. But if we're evaluating only after and not during our initiatives and work, we lose an opportunity to really tease apart and understand the system that we're situated in. And measurement, in a time where on the one hand, people working in social impact often try to legitimate their work through measurement and showing this specific impact. Yet at the same time, if we are only focusing on quantitative measures, there is so much to the story that is being missed. And that can have significant implications to how you mobilize and commit others to your cause. And then with respect to partnerships, no organization can solve these problems alone. And as we think about working within communities and engaging with various stakeholders across numbers of different organizations and community members, there are times where the partnerships themselves are not matched. The aspiration, the objectives, the skills, and the goals don't match, and we see struggles and failures in that space. But as we think to why we keep going, we also think about the pathways that we've seen in helping overcome that. And Kate's going to walk us through some of those pathways.
Okay, so We think about the first challenge around aspiration that Sara discussed. There's a need here to really think about specific objectives that allow organizations not to be frozen by broader aspirations. Now, those broader aspirations, those stretch goals, those imagined futures are really important to mobilize and motivate participation. But at the same time, individuals and employees need to understand and have a clear sense of how their activities, their actions, their work help contribute towards those broader goals. Right? What is their role within the change? Right? How do they contribute to that impact? So there's an interesting recent study by Carton. And the author finds this combination of aspiration and specific objectives in the case of the NASA moon landing, and finds that NASA as an organization paired those together. There was aspiration around furthering science and landing on the moon, but at the same time, the individuals within the organization had an understanding of how their work and their activities were contributing towards that broader goal, that huge aspiration in this case. Similarly, in our own work, we have seen the role of aspiration as well as specific objectives. Specifically, Sara and I have a study that looks at a nonprofit in Detroit called Food Lab, and this organization its mission is to further the goals of the good food movement, which is anchored on food that is fair and sustainable and contributes to local communities. And this nonprofit uses aspiration, has used aspiration in the form of developing an imagined future for its members. And that imagined future is really centered on the ideas of what a good food economy in the city could look like. And that vision is motivating and it is mobilizing, but at the same time, those broader aspirations are paired with, Food Lab pairs them with a real understanding or helping individual entrepreneurs understand how their daily activities and their individual businesses can contribute to those broader goals. So if we think about another pathway to overcoming some of these traps, we can consider the role of evaluation. So Sara mentioned this idea of evaluating progress throughout, not just at the end of an activity or an initiative, but along the way. And this is important for a number of reasons. Evaluating along the way allows an organization to realize when it may be going off course or not achieving objectives and to course correct. It's also important to evaluate progress throughout because then the organization can identify or better identify causality. You know, what kinds of activities and approaches are leading to certain outcomes. And that information is very helpful when thinking about social impact. So we see the role of evaluation across a number of different studies. And also the reference here to Smith and Basharoff, they have this interesting idea of, or finding rather, around the idea of guardrails. So the idea of a guardrail is, can the organization form a sense or direct attention to not just profit goals, but also the social mission. And organizational members can adopt the role of redirecting the organization or directing attention to those guardrails such that members are continuing to revisit how are we meeting our social goals. Another aspect of the pathway is in terms of measurement. So we really need to remember the power of the intangibles. Quantitative measures are very important, and we can learn a lot from that type of measurement, but not everything, right? There are aspects to impact and to progress that are difficult to capture through quantitative measures. So recognizing the power of emotion, the power of mobilizing a committed group of individuals, and the relationships that may be formed. So the way that the organization is interacting with and forming relationships with community organizations, with activists, and building that commitment. Those are all intangibles that can be very important, but difficult maybe to measure with quantitatively, I should say. So Sara and I have seen this in our work in a number of different ways. One is the example of the Food Lab organization that I talked about earlier. And this organization, this nonprofit in Detroit, continues to redirect employees' attention to different aspects of the city. So this idea of sense of hope in the city and the emotion that's attached to rebuilding and revitalization. And those intangibles have really served as a key sort of rallying point and motivating piece for a lot of their members. We also see them, the Food Lab organization, tap into the power of intangibles when it comes to affirmation. So a lot of members, and the members of Food Lab are individual entrepreneurs, and a lot of those members seek out the organization as an opportunity to connect with others that are similarly motivated by not just their business and forming and running their businesses, but at the same time their social goals. And that community of entrepreneurs provides affirmation to one another, so they don't feel like they're alone. So we see the power of intangibles in that case as well.
Similarly, in one of the pieces I looked at in my dissertation, where I tracked sustainability in a large Fortune 500 company over 18 months, comparing which issues gain attention and which lose. And as an example, when we started, there was one initiative that had a fantastic business case, looked like it was going to be really helpful with managing waste, and another that was more of a kind of community outreach around science and education. And everyone expected the issue with the business case to take off. Right? Here's a financial return. This is a priority for a for-profit company. Yet when we track 18 months later, the exact opposite happened. The issue that had the positive business case had faltered, fallen off the organizational agenda. Yet this program that focused on science education and community outreach had thrived. They had hired a new person to overrun this, had a dedicated budget. And what they found was that the intangible, the passion and the excitement of employees in working with high school students around science and trying to capture students before they had made any of these career choices that many of us have already made. This love of science that the employees themselves had brought out more and more people willing to commit time, executives willing to commit funds, and you saw this intangible passion, community, excitement leading to where there was the true impact that happened over that time frame. So again, the power of intangibles, and don't always try to force the business case on it. We want businesses, we need profit, but we need to recognize the importance and the power of these other components.
So finally, partnerships. No organization can achieve sustainable social impact alone. And there are a number of reasons why partnerships are important when it comes to social impact. Partners can complement one another in terms of their skills and their expertise and their influence. But partners can also help one another in terms of scale and scope, expanding impact into other geographic areas. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about sustainable partnerships and give some examples across some of our research. And we've identified some elements to sustainable partnerships, themes that carry across these different contexts.
And while this work has integrated across a number of papers that we've worked on, our initial framework has come from a case study we did on the Detroit Lions. And it was interesting, Kate's referred a few times to our project in Food Lab. Summer of 2013, we were immersed in Detroit. We were working with 5 different undergrads who were spending the summer in Detroit working on research with us. And as we were trying to understand Food Lab's role and the food economy in the city, we kept hearing from different people, you should talk to the Detroit Lions. And our reaction was kind of like, food in the city, like where are the Detroit Lions in all of this? But the Detroit Lions were clearly standing out to groups that they had partnered with as a unique, powerful partner who they enjoyed working with and felt like was really helping to move forward city revitalization. And so in the, true researcher approach, we were like, okay, let's go, right? Let's try to figure this out. And the Detroit Lions were fantastic partners for that research. So we were able to reach out and connect with their, at the time, Director of Community Relations, and interviewed a number of people from within the Detroit Lions organization and across the partners that they had around community relationships. And it was interesting at that time to be doing this because the Lions themselves had just changed their approach to community partnerships. So historically, their work would align with what we might think of as a more traditional philanthropic model. They had a set amount of funds that they were able to donate and commit to different groups within the community, and each year they would get proposals and give out money here and there. As their vice president of marketing at the time said, they were running all over the city doing this flotsam and jetsam, right? We're just kind of, and they stepped back and had a moment of a realization of saying, hey, Ford Field is located in downtown Detroit. We're in the midst of the bankruptcy, or at the time that they started this, it looked like bankruptcy might be imminent. We have a key role that we could play in the city, and we don't feel like we're doing as much as we could. And we would like to really think about what that might look like. And so, as Rob Woolley here mentions, we felt that the issues and the problems and the challenges required a completely different approach. And so what we found fascinating was being able to study how they designed that approach and how they leveraged partnerships with others in making that approach successful. And so one of the first steps that we recognized that they did, and that people mentioned and highlighted as distinct and positive, was that they started without an assumption of what they should do and what the needs are. So instead, they stepped back and said, there are a number of people around the city of Detroit, tons of organizations who are committed and engaged and have been here for years working on what this city looks like. What might revitalization be? What vision do we have for the city? And so they started by trying to understand, what are people doing? Who are some of the key actors? Meeting with other nonprofits, meeting with city leaders from a lens of learning. How do we learn and understand what are the needs here in this community that we want to engage? And then after doing that, they took time to say, okay, what are some of our strengths? What can the Lions really do? Because as much as I might be committed to green building, the Lions probably didn't have the expertise to be designing green infrastructure. But the Lions had key skills around health and wellness. They run a professional sports organization. They need to be thinking often around the wellness and the health and the eating habits of their team. They have executive chefs. All of this expertise in that space. And because of their headquarters being downtown, they had a lot of involvement around what neighborhoods might look like. How do we think about neighborhood spaces? How do we want our fans to engage in the community when they come to games? And how do we build this? And so they recognized that their skills aligned with needs in the city, specifically around health and wellness and neighborhood revitalization. And so they started really thinking through all of the different partnerships that they had, their work in the city, and considering who are good partners, who's already doing this work. How might we be able to connect with them and amplify the work that they're doing, providing additional resources, capacity, and skills to strengthen those who are already in this space, committed and doing a lot of work towards city revitalization in Detroit. And this was perceived by their partners. So again, we heard about Detroit by the Lions by hearing from their partners. And I think this exemplifies the lens that we were kind of recognizing. They use their base of supporters, their reach, and their brand to help elevate organizations that are already having the ability to make this impact. And they do it in a way that's aligned with their skills and their resources. So there's this clear connection between those two spaces. And so the next step that we did was really looking across all of the different partnerships that the Detroit Lions built as they launched this new initiative to say, what distinguishes these partnerships? How can we consider what we call sustainable partnerships in moving towards this impact in city revitalization? And what we find across these partnerships was 5 key characteristics that we highlight: respect and humility, an enabler role, authenticity, focusing on mutual benefits, and playing a role for brokerage. And we're going to walk through some of the examples with the Detroit Lions and other work that highlights these components of sustainable partnerships.
So the first characteristic is respect and humility. So the idea here is to listen, to listen to the perspective and the expertise and the interests of community organizations, of potential partners, and to demonstrate respect for those skill sets and for that expertise and for the relationships that have been long-standing. There's also an element here of respecting the influence that these organizations may have in the space or in the community. So we see this component of respect and humility across several different studies, including with the Detroit Lions, and what was reflected to us and what we were able to capture in terms of the sentiments of the Lions community partners, that they felt like they were heard, that they were listened to, they were asked their perspective, and they were treated with respect. I've also identified this characteristic of respect and humility in another study that I conducted on integrative medicine centers and programs. So in this case, in the integrative medicine case, large conventional healthcare systems were creating integrative medicine centers and programs. So centers and programs that brought together traditional or conventional medicine, I should say, and some complementary and alternative therapies. Now, community practitioners in this space, or in this case, were a bit worried about this kind of change. They were worried that their livelihoods were maybe threatened, and they were a bit skeptical of the growth and the rise of integrative medicine within conventional healthcare organizations. But what I found in several cases, multi-case study comparison, was that the leaders of integrative medicine programs, the ones that were successful, the physicians and the nurses in those organizations, reached out to community practitioners that were in the complementary and alternative medicine space and brought them in early to the change effort. They wanted to partner with them and really form a true partnership, not one in which a partner was dominated or usurped. So we saw, or my colleague and I saw that these community practitioners were brought in to participate in invited speaker series, brown bags within the healthcare systems. Some of them were eventually served as facilitators in medical school courses. So they really formed a partnership based on respect and appreciation of the skill sets and the expertise of those organizations and individuals in the community. Another component here, or characteristic of sustainable partnerships, is enabling, right? So there's an opportunity for an organization to assume the role of an enabler. That's coming to the relationship or coming to the partnership asking, how can we help? Sarah mentioned the Detroit Lions looking to the community and identifying organizations that were already in the space doing good work. And then going to them and say, what resources do you need? How can we support you? How can we amplify your efforts or accelerate the progress that you're making? So it's the juxtaposition of that and an imposing manner. So serving as an enabler. We also found this in our study of Food Lab, the organization that we referenced earlier, that is a nonprofit in the Detroit food economy. And Food Lab the whole sort of origin of this organization was to be an enabler. The leaders developed the organization to support the activities of small-scale food entrepreneurs in the city and to be a resource to those small businesses, asking, what can we provide? What do you need? And what grew out of seeking to play an enabler role was offering resources such as office hours for entrepreneurs to come and receive advice and feedback, the development of training programs and programs that allowed entrepreneurs to develop business plans or work on their marketing strategies. And the organization worked with entrepreneurs to identify funding opportunities. So it's playing that enabler role that has enabled Food Lab, also enabled them, to have a lasting involvement in the lives of good food entrepreneurs in the city.
It's funny, when we write our papers, we often co-write on Drive. So we'll be sitting across from each other but looking at the same screen. And I can't tell you how many times we're like, oh, we have enable 5 times in that sentence. We need to figure out how to
Gotta mix it up. Another key characteristic of partnerships that we've seen is authenticity. So really coming to the relationship with a genuine commitment to the relationship being more than just a one-off interaction or an interaction that's just based on funding or putting a logo on something, but really demonstrating a true commitment to the relationship and to the social cause or to the social impact. And this is important because it helps build trust. Organizations see that, or potential partner organizations see that true commitment, and they feel that they can help. It forms a basis for trust, and then better communication, and hopefully then a deeper relationship. So we saw this with the Detroit Lions, and reflected in the data that we collected from their partner organizations and the way those organizations spoke about the Lions. For example, one interviewee said, the Lions are involved even when their logo isn't on the activity, and so we really see that genuine commitment.
I think the authenticity piece comes in often as we consider specifically this role of business engaging in social good, when so often we have a consumer base that's concerned around, is this a marketing ploy? Right? Is this greenwashing if I'm an environmental consumer? How do we consider and engage and think about people's real commitment? And so there are all different types of challenges in uncovering that from a consumer lens. What we see also, though, is the importance for that in a relationship, right? The recognition that your partners are authentically committed to that aspiration and aligned on the objectives that you'll be working on towards that, and that it's not just a ploy or a funding option.
And of course, all partnerships have to be mutually beneficial. But beyond that, there's an opportunity to identify and highlight and continue to revisit how the different partners in the relationship are able to achieve their objectives, and that's clear, and that there is alignment and continued alignment around those mutual benefits. We saw this idea of mutual benefits in a study that we haven't talked about yet, and that was a project in which Sarah and I studied the activities of a community health and wellness foundation. And this organization really had a commitment and a mission to promote the health and wellness of the members of a number of different towns in its jurisdiction. And instead of coming in with, well, we think this is how each of these towns should engage with promoting health and wellness, the foundation worked to partner with and help form and develop community coalitions. And those community coalitions were composed of residents of the different towns who were there voluntarily interested in working with the foundation in terms of promoting different activities around health and wellness. So the coalitions came up with their own plans for how their towns could leverage different resources and address different needs and opportunities to promote those healthy behaviors in their community. So the foundation in that case is promoting its mission, working towards its mission of healthy culture, and the coalitions and the residents in the communities feel like their needs are heard and their resources are being leveraged, and the programs and activities and organizations that they're interested in seeing get support are doing so.
And it was really interesting to hear the lens around mutual benefits from so many different places. And I think what comes out almost as a strong foil is what we would hear people comparing some of these organizations to. And so it appears that there are a number of places that come and want to dictate very specific strategies, right? This is our best practice. This is what you need to do. This is what we do with every partner, right? Or this is our way, and this is what the partnership looks like. Instead of having more of a two-way street engagement of recognizing the benefits for all of the parties in the partnership, and again, coming back to this lens of amplifying. The fifth component that we kind of highlight and talk through as we consider these sustainable partnerships comes with the lens of brokerage. And so the idea of brokerage in general is I know Kate, and I also know somebody else who likes the stuff that Kate likes, and I'm in a position of power because I can connect the two of them. Right? I'm the flow through which that information goes. What we found here is really this strengthening relationships through making the connections, and at times taking yourself out of the relationship altogether, but working to build what we were calling a social infrastructure for impact. Right? This is the network of people who are caring about and excited about and committed to a specific social issue, and they all strengthen their own partnerships as well as the impact that they're having in the community by connecting different organizations that are committed to key goals and issues. And what was fascinating when you look at a case like the Detroit Lions was their recognition at times of the status and the power and the privilege that they had by being the Detroit Lions. Right? And one of them said at some point, you know, if I call someone up and say the Detroit Lions wants to talk to you, there's a really good chance I'm going to get a call back. Right? But thinking about how they used that position to connect others who may not have known about the work that they were doing. Perhaps using some of the spaces and resources that they had available to connect people together and give them the time and the space to be thinking about, strategizing, and engaging around the different activities that they have and programs that they're doing. And with something that came up again and again as a strategy that people appreciated in really feeling this lens of authenticity, but also a lens of strengthening their work through these connections. I've seen this also in another research project that I've been working on the Environmental Defense Fund. So Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, runs a Climate Core program. I like to call it a matchmaking program. I don't think they like when I call it a matchmaking program, but they have a number of professional graduate students who are interested in work in climate change and sustainability. But for those of you in that space, it can be a hard space to find where the right internships are and how that works. So EDF also has a network of a number of companies, nonprofits, and municipalities who are struggling with and challenging with and working to address climate change and sustainability issues. And they connect those two. Right? They go through the process of figuring out which are the best. One of the years we did a deep dive on the study in 2016. They had over 800 applicants that they reviewed to figure out which are the 100 so strongest applicants. How does that match with these potential hosts we have now for having them work through their fellowship for 12 weeks over the summer engaging in these issues? And what are the skills and resources we need to provide to enable the success and push forward this movement around addressing climate and sustainability in business? And that program has been in place for over 10 years now, And what's really fascinating is exploring the network that EDF has built through brokering these different connections. And so we were able to look at that tracking over time. And I realize this is small, but in a minute, the smallness won't matter as much because the comparative value across a few different photos will make it make sense. But just to kind of give you a lens here, the circles are different organizations. So if Dow Chemical hosted an EDF fellow, there's a circle up there that's Dow Chemical. And the connections are lines. So if Dow Chemical hosted a fellow who is an herb student here at the University of Michigan, there is a line between Dow and the University of Michigan. And what we were able to do is track how information flowed and how connections built across these through EDF continuing to broker across more and more organizations. So we saw this expand over time and densen as we see more organizations working more closely together, exchanging this information. What was really fascinating to see as someone committed to business and sustainability is if we look at the issues that these businesses are focusing on over time, they move from sustainability issues around efficiency and resource use into much more challenging strategic lenses around innovation and design. So we're not only seeing a bigger group of people focusing on these issues, but also more nuanced and technical and challenging focuses of innovation in that space, providing greater impact than that we can have through these efforts. And so as we reflected on all of these different components, we think it's really helpful to recognize the different characteristics of sustainable partnerships, but also understanding that they relate and reinforce each other. Authenticity builds the trust, respect and humility strengthens that. This enables the exchange of information you need to both enable each other and recognize the mutual benefits that you're looking to have. And through connecting each other on that, you up the amount of trust that is there to begin with and only continue to strengthen and grow these partnerships towards social impact and positive change in communities and our world. We want to thank you. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. The boxes are up there to toss around. Thank you.
Question. Questions?
Thank you for the great presentation. Andy Anuzis, Cornerstone Schools, City of Detroit. First, as a long-suffering Lions fan, thank you for putting such a good foot forward.
Yeah, my kids are like, oh, the Lions are teaching me how to lose spectacularly.
Awesome stuff. So at Cornerstone Schools, we have a footprint of about 3,000 students in our city, Detroit, and it's as much about providing great education, but try to give kids a sustaining life and a good future. What we find often, though, is if you could put a little bit more emphasis on, many organizations love to come in for one-offs. Yep. They've got the bright T-shirts, their marketing people show up, lots of cameras flashing, and they say, well, our millennials love this. These like really quick hits, and we'd love to hit lots of places around town. And that's actually more often than not a burden to a nonprofit than it is a benefit. And I was just wondering if you could maybe amplify that a little bit and see if that's part of your...
No, I think it's critical. And I do think that is a key lens that we heard from people about the Detroit Lions often was they're not in to just give us money and run, right? One of the activities was a revitalization on Avenue of Fashion, and they talked about how there was funding provided and alum players from the Lions came in and engaged in some of the envisioning. They partnered with other groups and really saw things through, right? It wasn't to come in and out. I think it's also something that's impacted both of our teaching and what we've seen become more and more of a conversation at Michigan when we consider what is the role of something like engaged learning and how do we ensure that if our students are partnering and working with community partners, we're doing it in a way that is sustainable and not something that is more detrimental by coming in, taking up a bunch of resources, and leaving without an outcome. And U of M, I think, has some really interesting structures in place to help amplify that, one example is SEAL, which is our community engaged active learning. I'm so sorry for not having the acronym correct, but they actually partner with faculty in thinking about how do we design community partnerships in a way that are sustainable. And so again, I think that this is a key issue because we don't want to be the photo op on Instagram, but then that's not impact, right? If we're thinking about coming back to that lens of how do we make people's lives better, that's what we want to ensure is the primary focus, and then aligning the actions to them. Thanks.
Over here. Hi. Shall I stand? Or? All right. So great presentation. Thank you so much for coming. I had a quick question about just the authenticity aspect. Forgive me for being a cynic, but I kind of follow the shareholder idea, or shareholder theory, I should say, which is the idea that companies are just out there to make money. Being a raw student, being exposed to all these big finance companies, all of a sudden every company has a CSR initiative. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, is there an easy way to kind of tell if a company is genuinely committed to making a difference, and then is that a quantifiable thing or an intangible thing?
I find as someone who studies this a lot that it's more intangible than I wish. I think that with concerns like sustainability reporting not being regulated, but many now doing because of a peer pressure lens, right? 15 years ago, if you looked at sustainability reports, almost no one issued them. And if you look today, I think it's something like over 80% of Fortune 500 companies issue sustainability reports. And if you look at North America and Europe, it's even higher. And we know that not all of those companies are companies we would think of as sustainable companies. Right? So I think there are lenses that we can go through to engage in some of that authenticity. What actions are they really taking? What commitment outside of money that looks good? When you look at a sustainability report, is there continuity over time in showing progress? Or does it just look like 50 pages of commercials that are put together and change every year? There are a lot of companies that are doing really great work, specifically in the sustainability space, in trying to articulate and quantify that, but it's a newer space still for businesses. I personally think that statements like Larry Fink's and the follow-up actions, if he continues to engage, are going to be driving this change. If for your analyst reports, you have to report on what social impact you're having, and you have BlackRock that's going to change what they issue about you because you reported something that they didn't believe or they didn't agree with, now we're going to start seeing more and more change. And we're seeing examples with that often. I think Unilever is often talking about how they acquired Ben & Jerry and now in the 7th generation, and they have all of these companies that are meant to be their sustainable companies, but they're learning from all of them what to bring in other parts of their business. And so as we see these pressures from consumers, from investors, from other companies to each other, we all clearly want profit, right? If we don't have profit, we don't have business. But how do we think about and recognize our impact in business beyond profit, I think is where the question's going. I think it's an exciting space to be thinking about a career.
Other questions? Okay.
Rob is like the person to blame for some of these, quotes right here. So.
Yeah. Hey. So I have, it's more kind of a comment, but on the last point that was made, so coming from a background in environment and sustainability in undergrad, I guess I was surprised when I started working on the EDF project about the viability of a path for someone who is engaged in environmental and sustainability work to work for a company like Facebook, for example, right? That's not what you'd imagine as like a sustainable job, like I'm going to go into forestry. No, you're like going into a major company. But the reality of that, and as you've described, is just, that impact. It's important to have someone at the table at these organizations to be having those conversations. So while it's not always the most intuitively, it's not the most intuitive thing to see environmental people or sustainability initiatives or some of these companies to be leaders in that space, I think it's an essential part of that, and it's just really necessary. So just the two sides of that, I guess.
No, I think coming back to the partnership lens, I think it's having people at the table, even if it starts off symbolic, that is who community partners are reaching out to, who consumers are pressuring. We start seeing these trends that make things expected now that weren't expected 10 or 15 years ago.
Thank you both. This was fabulous. And I wanted to ask Kate if you could elaborate. I got really fascinated by this idea of intangibles. And when you mentioned Food Lab and you mentioned hope and how they kept hope alive with these intangibles, can you give some more examples of how you saw these organizations using intangibles?
Yeah, so one of the things that interested us when we were looking at Food Lab was this idea that they're really situated in a social movement space around promoting the goals of the good food movement. And so often when we think of social movements, we think of organizations that are coming in with a strong anti-establishment, anti-some practices and activities that are happening. But Food Lab really adopted a positive stance. This is what we want to be, or this is what we want to see. And that was that vision of an imagined future. So painting a picture of what the Detroit food economy could look like, and using that as the rallying point and as the way to mobilize members, in this case individual entrepreneurs. And so we talk about it in various iterations of the study and of papers as they're tapping into sense of place. And also livelihood, so sense of place and livelihood, that individual entrepreneurs, residents of the city felt this connection to Detroit in terms of what the city had been through, what it could be, the grit, and at the same time they wanted to support their families. They needed to create viable businesses. And so the idea that an organization could come in and paint and create an envisioned future that connected those two, how livelihoods could then be their own livelihoods and furthering their businesses and supporting their families, could also be contributing to this broader picture and this broader landscape of what the city and what the food economy could be. And you know, as in other cases, you would see the organization referencing or bringing in almost alums, right, and as a sort of best practices, or showing those positive case studies of look at folks that have had some success in this space. Because in the case of Detroit, there are a lot of examples of failure. So those were very important elements to bring in and to showcase.
One of the things we argue in our paper is that vision and that promotion of a future actually made it more inclusive and engaging for entrepreneurs from various backgrounds, various races, across gender, and so it fostered diversity and information exchange because people were inspired and excited and saw themselves all as part of this potential future and the role that they could play. And that brought forth amazing growth in their membership and success of many of their member businesses as we track it over time.
I'd also note, at the risk of painting too rosy of a picture, that
which some of our reviewers think.
That, yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot that we try to bring in around. Sarah mentioned the piece around diversity and the tense conversations that can be had around. Okay, so when we talk about funding, we need to recognize as a group that some members of our community have had more difficulty in securing funding than others, and those could be tied to demographic variables and some understanding of different individuals' role and experience in the city. Are they a new sort of transplant, or have they come from, has their family been in the city for a long time? And so working through some of those dynamics was certainly a part of this. It didn't just start right away with everyone being on board towards the same shared vision.
But all of it very intangible.
Okay, wonderful. So I would like to thank Kate and Sarah for a wonderful talk. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. Oh, wow, look at this.
And as our tradition is, we have a small token of our appreciation, and this is a positive spiral, and somehow it kind of reminds me of your research, so thank you guys.
Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So I hope you guys join us for our first session in 2019. Stephanie Creary will be here from Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania talking about how can we create inclusive workplaces. So it will be, once again, an amazing session. So thank you for today. Thank you, Sarah and Kate.
Thank you.